Today, we talk running back. We go through our tiers as well as price points for all of these tiers, what we would take to move between them, as well as which players we expect to actually be league winners down the stretch. Stick around for all that and more. And welcome into the Dino Construction Podcast. I'm your host, Justin, joined with my co hosts, David and JP. Good to have the band back together. Always more fun with a threesome. How are you guys doing this week in Dynasty? I'm going to start with David, who lost to me twice this week.
Yeah, other than that, I've been doing great. Thanks for bringing that up, though. I really appreciate it.
I got you, fam. JP, how was your Dynasty week?
Prior week, which wasn't good, but this week it was a good rebound. So I'm feeling pretty good. It's definitely a weekly emotional roller coaster.
Especially just when the two of us, the fan favorites are doing well, and then David's over here struggling, losing to me twice. It's just always fun to see.
That was a close matchup. Oh my gosh.
Yeah, that I don't know anybody that remembers, probably not, unless you also had Kamara in a close one. He had a drop on their second to last drive. Would have been probably about 10 yards. I lost by 1.8 PPR settings. So you're lucky Kamara dropped my win, Justin.
I'm actually ecstatic about that. And we appreciate all of you who have been with us throughout our whole tier video series here. We would be honored if any of you have been following along and have not subscribed yet. Go ahead and hit that subscribe button. Number one way you can help out the channel for free. Hit that like button on the video too. Really appreciate it. Thank you all so much. With that being said, let's hop right in. Now, moving into our RB tiers that we're going to discuss. We, of course, starting up at the top with tier 1 here. Not going to see Alvin Kamara in here, but what types of players are we looking for in tier 1, JP?
These are those guys that were very, very confident in their job security for at least the next few years. And these are guys that we think are borderline top 5, top 3 running backs for this season. And yeah, these guys are just pretty much the young studs of the league right now. Who we got in here, Justin?
Those young guys, same as they were in the offseason, and I think we'll have a fun discussion about whether or not we should be expanding this tier or changing it a little bit. But those three guys are Bijan Robinson, Brees Hall, and Jahmyr Gibbs. Currently 5th, 6th, and 7th for total fantasy points at the position. After week 8, we see Brees and Bijan have over a 70% snap share. My Lions boy Gibbs just had a 55%. What is it, Sonic and Knuckles? Is that what they're going by in Detroit these days? So splitting a lot of carries with David Montgomery. Is this something that we're concerned about, that near 50-50 snap share? Because he's been incredibly efficient, and I think he's the type of player that, with how fast he is, actually might benefit from this kind of arrangement. What do you guys think? Is that something we're concerned at all about? He is the highest in points per game out of these guys.
I mean, yeah, shockingly, he has 19 receptions to both Bijan and Brees are over 30 receptions, but Gibbs did have his bye week, to be fair. But yeah, he's still been better than both of those guys in fantasy points per game, and he's just breaking off long runs. That offense looks fantastic. So if you're in a great offense and you're an explosive player who's efficient, yeah, I'm not super concerned. I am a little bit more encouraged by Bijan's usage, and probably Brees is a little bit more too, but yeah, I don't care that much really.
Yeah, I mean, the days of the workhorse running back are basically beyond us. Gibbs is going to be one of the highest scorers. Like you said, he's super efficient. That offense is still, and I don't think anybody's going to have to leave soon. I could be wrong, Justin. You're the Lions fan. Correct me if I'm wrong, but it sounds like they're going to be together for a while. I see no reason why Gibbs can't keep this up.
Yeah, they just extended Monty. Their offensive line is pretty locked up. Amon-Ra's locked up. Goff's locked up. They got other guys on rookie contracts as far as Williams and Laporta. I think probably the status quo is just the expectation. And I think he's a guy, because of the usage, actually is more likely to stay healthy, would be kind of the way I read into it. I'm probably looking at him as RB1 at this point, although even if he is RB1, are we willing to pay anything to go between these guys at this point? I'll start with JP first.
Yeah, I think that I see Bijan and Gibbs. I just like them more than Brees just due to the fact that they were both top 10 draft picks and that they're a year younger as well. So I probably would pay a third to give from Brees up to Bijan and Gibbs, but that would be the absolute most that I would pay because I think that these guys are all great.
Yeah, it's kind of hard to want to pay to go in between any of these guys. I do kind of agree that I have Brees at the bottom of this tier, and if I were to move from one to another, it would have to be from Brees to either Gibbs or Bijan. But we've seen some elite scoring from Brees recently. I think he definitely has a league-winning season or two in him before his prime's over. So, like you said, maybe a third if I was feeling frisky that day, but even then, I don't know. I'd probably just stand pat. I'd certainly take a second or better. I'd probably take, I don't know if I would take a third to move like from Bijan down to Brees? I guess that's another way to ask that question, though.
Yeah, I think that it's pretty close between these guys as well. I think I'm on the same page as JP. I wouldn't pay a second to upgrade from Brees to those guys, but I think I'd probably pay a third to upgrade to Bijan or Jameer just because of that ACL kind of lingering in Brees's background. I think also I feel like I'd be de-risking slightly getting younger and a little healthier career arc wise, but very similar guys. Now, how sure are we that this should be a tier of just three? There's some other guys in tier two, not very far off in the age category, outproducing some of these guys. Do we have a little bit of take lock from before the season when we had these three guys in tier one alone, or should they still be standing alone until we see a little bit more from the tier two guys?
I don't really see a case for Bijan and Jameer being in a tier with guys like Achane and Kyron and Kenneth Walker. If you wanted to try to convince me that our top two tiers should maybe be three tiers and Brees Hall should move down, I might be able to listen to that. But like Bijan's had 3 20+ point games in a row. Gibbs might even have 2 30-point games in a row. I'd have to double check. I don't think he had 30 this week, but he blew up.
70-yard touchdown is really great for your stat line.
Yeah, I think it was like 32 weeks ago and 20 last week. I mean, Brees Hall is a little inconsistent as the Jets offense is very inconsistent right now. Bijan and Gibbs are 23 and Brees is 24. So another knock on him. That's how I have it personally. So I wouldn't change it, but I do think Brees is closer to that tier than he was going into the season.
Yeah, and there is one guy in tier two that I'm fairly, I've at least considered putting in tier one, but I'll talk about that later. It's just the fact that this tier, they're at least a year, if not 2 years younger than some of the guys in the next tier. And the points per game gap, I don't think is big enough yet for me to put those guys up here. But like I said, there's one guy that I will discuss that I think is pretty close.
All right. And then last question I just want to discuss because we are promising that price point on each tier. I think the price point we established at the beginning of the season was probably 2 firsts for these guys, right? We're not looking to shuffle too early firsts or anything. Probably we might consider a non-playoff first and a late first if it's not looking to be like the 101, 102. Are we considering 2 mid firsts? Like what are the combinations you're willing to pay at this point, guys?
I think it's still about the same. If I need the running back help and I think that Bijan Gibbs Brees is going to give me that championship, yeah, I would still pay the 2 firsts as long as they're not top 4 picks.
Yeah, I think that's about where I have it too. If I feel like I can get an early first, I want to keep that flexibility. But if it's, looking to be the 104, 5 or 6, maybe somewhere in that range, I'll take that bet that it doesn't land on the 104 and then a playoff first. I'd pay that for Bijan and Gibbs, probably Brees, but that one would make me think twice at least,
Kind of inbox-ish offer that I have available in a league that I will have to make sure I accept before Trav Bob listens to this. He's willing to take 2 probable non-playoff firsts, but neither of them are projected to be 2 or 3 unless things really turn to left field. These guys should be like the 104, 5, 6 type of picks, but they're probably both going to miss the playoffs. I'd get Bijan, I'd get Chubb, and I could either get Komet, which is kind of tempting, or a early second. Should I be taking this?
Which league, real quick?
You're not in this league.
Oh, okay.
It's also only half PPR for what that's worth. RBs are a little bit more valuable. They're my only firsts that I have left. Would you guys pull the trigger on that? I'm the number one. I'm projected to have a buy at this point. I'm currently in line for a buy. And I have Jordan Mason, who I've been relying on a little bit. Tell me what to do, Dad.
No, I would do that, yeah, because you never know. In the playoffs, you could, even though you're the playoff bye, you could lose and be in that third place game, and then then you're really upset for not having, the extra hammer that you might need. So yeah, I would definitely do that, especially if you can get a second as well. And Chubb, I think I probably would.
I currently have Kelsey and then no inheritance plan at tight end. Would you consider taking Komet to the early second with how he's been doing to kind of lock up that position longer term? Since I have Kelsey and I also have the usual suspects, Gesicki and Jonnu Smith on my bench.
Any premium?
There is no premium, only half PPR. Should I just take the second at this point?
Yeah, if you're going to do it, because I think that also gives you some flexibility from trading your 2 firsts. And look, from the other side of this, from Trav Bob's perspective, we got to assume he's rebuilding.
He is not very good.
I'd take the gamble on 2 non-playoff firsts for that package too. I think it works out for both of you, to be honest.
Yeah, and I think you can just figure out tight end later, whether it's a Jake Ferguson, David Njoku. I mean, you might even be able to get those guys for an early second in the offseason.
All right. Well, you guys go ahead and keep working on the podcast real quick. I'm going to send out a trade offer real quick.
Well, I think we can move on to the next tier here. And the way that I'm defining tier 2 is we're looking at guys that we believe are talented enough to finish top 5 of the position and expect to use at least a few years of RB1 type of production. And David, who do we have in this tier?
Yeah, I'll go ahead and read that. We've got Kyron Williams, Kenneth Walker III, Devon Achane, and Jonathan Taylor. Probably a few names some people would expect here, but we decided to go mostly with youth here because a lot of the older guys, you don't know if you can expect more than 1 year out of. And these guys, we do think we're going to get a couple years of top end production out of. At least that was my personal rationale for ranking these guys in a tier above. They're hammers, guys, and they're all, I want to say 25 or younger. Taylor might be turning 26 soon, but JP, you want to go ahead and talk to me about these guys? I see you got some pretty good stuff here.
Both Kenneth Walker and Kyron Williams have been great this year. They're RB5 and 6 in fantasy points per game, and they're both just 24 years old. They are right in that hammer conversation, and they're still very young. So I think that there is a chance that these guys could jump into tier 1. We know Kyron's the workhorse of his backfield, but if Kenneth Walker, he seems like he's taking the reins from Zach Charbonnet. So which one of those guys do you think is most likely to jump into tier 1? And what would you pay for them?
So for me, the non-Jonathan Taylor guys honestly all have, I think, about an equal shot at jumping into tier 1, which I think what David said previously, that I think what's more likely is kind of a separation of Bijan and Jameer. If Bijan keeps performing like he has the last few weeks, Jameer does, and Brees continues to be a victim of Aaron Rodgers, that we see Brees Hall and the three younger guys here, or the highest performers amongst these younger guys, in kind of a second standalone tier on their own. I know this is a little bit of a cop-out, but whoever stays healthy and performs the best out of these three guys. Like, I think if all three of them perform how they have been performing, with Achane, I will put the caveat of Tua staying healthy, of course. Like, we saw that he is nerfed incredibly without a real offense there. That these three guys, I don't really think that there's any justification to have Brees Hall ahead of them in 3 weeks, unless Brees Hall and that offense like kind of figure it out. Not an indictment necessarily on Brees Hall, just if Kenneth Walker and Kyron Williams and Achane are all averaging over 20 points a game, which I think is, what we've been seeing out of the first two, and what I think we've been seeing out of Achane typically with Tua, how do you put a Brees Hall that's averaging like 16, 17 points a game, full tier ahead of them in Dynasty? Because these guys should keep doing that, to be honest with you. They're all under contract again the following year. Like, we expect the same thing out of them for the next couple of years. Like, I think that's kind of my thought process on this tier, and why it's kind of a lot less disgusting of a position, it seems, than it was, like, in our opinion, a few months ago. Do you kind of agree there, David? At least on the disgusting not being as bad?
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of like the opposite of tight end, right? We were super high on the tight ends, and they were pretty ugly. This is a good tier too. I'd love to live in it with my RB1. I will say I think the next RB to enter tier 1 is Ashton Janty. A little preview of our 25 class update that we're going to do here in a couple of weeks. But look, with Kyron, I'll just go through the three younger guys that we're talking about with Kyron. People look for excuses not to like him. I don't know that his value will ever be that of a tier 1 running back, even if he should be. So he's kind of hard for me to think to get up there. Kenneth Walker is probably the most likely, in my opinion. He has the least strikes against him. He has a new offense that really seems to work out for him. Does have an older quarterback, but they should be able to replace him without losing much efficiency at the running back position, we hope. Then you think about that and you go to Miami and you see what happens when their quarterback gets hurt, and Achane goes from a top 6 guy at the position to an RB3, it looked like. So that's kind of out of his control. And unless they address their backup quarterback position, I think that's going to be a knock on his value. I don't know. Do you guys think I'm overreacting to that? Or do you think Tua's injury history actually is affecting Achane's value also?
I think maybe it is a little bit of that, but also just the fact that Achane himself hasn't really proved to be, super healthy as well. Because, I mean, that's the difference between him and Gibbs. Is they're both smaller. I mean, we know Gibbs is small, but Achane's even smaller. We know he's explosive as well, but he could have, the type of season that we're seeing from Jahmyr Gibbs. And it's just the fact that I just don't trust the health of both him and the quarterback. So that's why I think him being a tier 2 makes more sense. Is he somebody that you're willing to buy if you knew the hammer, or would you rather have Kyron Kenneth Walker by a decent margin?
I think I'd probably pay the same for any of those roughly. I mean, maybe some different pieces around the edges, but I think you're probably looking at guaranteed at least a decent first, probably a first and a second, I would say, and then maybe you got to work out the details of the trade after that. But I don't know. Do you guys feel the same about a first and a second?
Show sheet, I believe I'm the one who wrote this question here. That was the question I asked. A mid 25 first and second. Is that the price on this tier? I kind of think it is. I'm curious because we have JT in the same tier, but I feel like, at least for David, I would expect you're not willing to pay a first and a second for this 25-year-old running back. Do you think it's more like a first and a third for JT? Kind of turning the question around a little bit on you. Or would you be willing to pay that same price if you needed it and couldn't get anything better?
I was gonna say I'd have to go down the line first, but if that's really the best I could do, and at least think about, I'd want to still have some flexibility after the trade so that I could still address other holes. But if I need a running back one and I've got the flexibility and picks to make that deal, I think I could still do a first and a second. I wouldn't love it, but I think there are leagues where that would be what you would need.
Yeah, I mean, we see in 2021. I mean, Jonathan Taylor is the RB1, so we know he has that. I don't know if I could do it.
That was also just a really down scoring RB year as well, like from a points per game standpoint. I think he was right around 20-ish. He wasn't like in that 25 range, like we see, true difference makers like CMC in his prime, or Kyron last year was a lot closer to that. But just kind of a little caveat on that. Like, I don't think he has that elite, like RB1 in a difference maker, league breaking type of way.
True league winner, yeah, for the cost. Yeah, I know what you mean. I mean, before we move out of this year, though, I just wanted to talk about Kyron. He was the one guy that I was kind of thinking should move up potentially. I was kind of on the fence about, because last year he was the RB2, and I feel like we almost kind of forget that he was killing it last year. He was a true difference maker, and we just had to lower him because they brought in Blake Corum and they talked about how they want a split backfield. But no, Kyron Williams, he's the guy leading the backfield, and he's been phenomenal. He gets goal line work, he gets receiving work. The offense was pretty bad there for a while, but it seems like it's turning around now that they're getting their weapons back. And also on Sleeper, I'm seeing he has an 86% snap share, and 86 compared to Brees Hall has the second highest at 76. So yeah, he's a true workhorse, one that we don't really see nowadays.
I do think David's point just about the perceived value, the perceived lack of job security because of where he was drafted. Like the guys in tier 1, right? Brees, although a second round draft pick, RB1 drafted in the class, 2 top 10 draft picks, right? Like, I think David's point about like KW3 having the highest chance to move up just because he was also a second round draft pick when Brees was taken, right? Like, just that draft capital. Whether or not we should care about it, especially, given the fact that the Rams we've seen get a gem in Puka, and they seem to just not really care about draft capital. I think they care about who's good on the field, which you kind of wish more NFL teams did. I think there's like a little bit of reactionaryism. Like, I have that voice in my head, like, are we sure he's still got the job next? Even though we've seen everything, like it's just kind of dents the value just enough. Do you kind of feel like that's the same, JP, or not necessarily? Not his value on your team, but the market value, of course.
Right, and like maybe we should take advantage of that, that difference in perceived value. But yeah, I know what you mean, because there is a history of day 3 running backs where they have the job, and sure enough, like Dameon Pierce, of course, Dameon Pierce wasn't the same degree as what we've seen from Kyron, from on the field perspective, but they just lose the job next year. Rashad White, even, he was he might have been a 3rd or 4th round pick, and yeah, he seems like he's losing his job. So I think that is why. It's because of the history of day 3 running backs just not being able to, really be the guy for 5-6 years typically.
I also think this is a good opportunity to kind of talk about how when you're doing tiers for Dynasty, it's not necessarily the utility of the player on your roster specifically, but also the market value plays a big role in that. And it is really just our perception of the market value, because that's the best we can do. But when we talk about like a guy like Kyron, for example, he's going to probably be the same thing on your roster for the next few years as those guys in tier 1. I just don't think you'll ever get the return for him. And if he does face like a major injury, his chance of retaining or regaining that value is a little bit lower. And so I think for me, that's why I have him in a lower tier. But like JP said, that's something to take advantage of. Go get those points for cheaper. If you can tier down from one of those tier 1 guys to Kyron, this isn't in the show sheet, but I think it's a great question. Like, what would it take? Would you do a 1-2 swap? Would you do a second alone, or does it take a first? How much would it take to tier down from, say, Gibbs to Kyron?
When you make it Gibbs or Bijan, it definitely makes it a little different than Brees. But for Gibbs and Bijan, I don't think I'm quite at a second. I think I'm kind of close, even though, like I said, I'm really high on him. But a 1-2 swap for sure, I would do that.
Yeah, if I could get a first to tier down off of those guys to him, I would be ecstatic to do that. I would not be willing to add a first to tier up.
All right, guys, I think that about does it for tier 2. Let's go ahead and move to tier 3. Justin, you want to tell us what we're looking at here in this tier?
This is an interesting tier. Within tier 3, a lot of those guys who are also RB1s at this point, potentially the RB1, or have historically been the RB1s and been injured. We do have a young guy who has not played at all yet in this tier, so a little bit of an outlier in the tier. A guy that I am very excited to have a conversation about because he is an RB1, but is substantially younger than the rest of this pack. And who are those guys we have in this tier, David?
Yeah, we've got Saquon Barkley, James Cook, Jonathan Brooks, Christian McCaffrey, Derrick Henry, and Joe Mixon. It's like you said, some old hammers and a couple of young guys that certainly have some upside. I kind of think this is a good place to start since we're fresh off talking about tier two. If you're a competitor, how are you treating the value difference between these old guys, these old hammers, and the guys in tier two? Are you willing to pay anything to move up? Are you looking to tier down if you've got a guy in tier two? Maybe add a draft pick to keep some flexibility. What are we doing here if we're competing, guys? Ignore Cook and Brooks for that question.
In general, if I'm able to get pretty close to cash value, like if I'm able to get, let's say, like a valuation that's like approaching a first for one of these old guys in a tier up to a guy that I expect to have approximately the same production, let's say any of those guys in the tier above, while getting substantially younger, like I'd probably be willing to pay one of these old guys. And if I had them to spare 2 seconds, I'd consider a 1-2 swap in one of these old guys if I vetted the draft pick and I had the flexibility as well. In general, my strategy is I'm ecstatic to take an old running back, get younger, and not lose a lot of production.
Yeah, it's Joe Mixon and Derrick Henry. They're RB1 and 2 in points per game. But I think in a smaller sample, especially for Joe Mixon, the points per game isn't drastically different from Kenneth Walker, Kyron Williams, and what we would expect from, Achan, Taylor. I would definitely pay a second, 2 seconds. It kind of depends, like you said, Justin, on the flexibility. Honestly, I don't know. I probably wouldn't pay 2 seconds if I only had just the two, but I pay a second and a third for sure, because then you're getting 3, 4, maybe 5 years younger if you're trading away Derrick Henry, and you're only paying a second and third for similar production. I think that's something that we should inquire on.
Maybe a second and a third. For me, though, if I'm competing and I've got the RB1 or 2 on the season, I'm not really excited to move that player. I understand getting a few years younger is nice, but so is having the flexibility of that extra second and third. I don't know. I think it's something interesting to look at. I personally think if you have someone in tier 2 and you're kind of strapped for flexibility, you don't have any extra picks, you're looking at making a playoff run, but you're competing, probably wise to try to tier down from one of those guys and pick up this value we're talking about to get the same running back production, but open up some flexibility on your roster. Do you guys agree with that if you're a little strapped for assets?
Depends on what I'm getting.
Yeah, if I'm getting 2 seconds back, I think I would. Yeah, but for 1 second and a third, maybe.
I don't know. For me, these are guys I love to buy, and I want to buy these guys kind of for cash prices, or I would be ecstatic to try to add like what I project to be a mid to late second to like a young hype guy like a Tank Bigsby, or potentially even like a Bucky Irving type of guy to try to get like a Derrick Henry or a Joe Mixon. Something along those lines is a type of deal that I'm looking to do. I really don't want to tear down off of like the safe feeling of having a guy that I think can give me RB1 production for 2 or 3 more years that I have in the tier above. So I think I'm going to kind of just disagree. Unless I'm getting a first back to tear down, I'm probably out.
If you don't have any first or second this year, I mean, would you trade Kenneth Walker for 2 seconds to get Joe Mixon?
Probably not.
Okay.
Interesting.
I'd consider it though. It just depends. If I have a bunch of holes to fill, sure. Like if I need the seconds because I know I have like a bunch of other holes to fill. But to be honest with you, like if I feel like I need to pick up the more assets because I'm not doing so well, then like do I really want to get that much older and just lose all of that value? Besides, I mean, I get 2 seconds, but like Mixon could fall off a cliff. I just think it's not the process I want to go, is getting older like this. I feel like I'd rather dive a little bit farther down the line potentially and make sure I'm getting a first back if I really want to do that, if that makes sense.
I think that's fair. I think in some cases I would agree with you, but most I'm looking to have the least value and the most production at running back position personally. Just wanted to ask one more question since you touched on Justin, and then I'll let you guys ask your questions. Cash price for these guys. Are we paying a first? Are we adding to that first? I mean, Brooks and Cook are a little different, but let's just focus on these old farts still. Are we paying more than a first for these guys?
Are you including Saquon in the old farts?
Of course.
I would definitely pay a first for Saquon and CMC as well, but Mixon and Henry make me a little more nervous. Probably not unless I really, really didn't have. If I shopped around, that was my absolute best option. I don't think I could do it for Derrick Henry. Actually, at 30, he's about to turn 31 in a few months.
Justin, where are you at?
One of the most interesting like conversations I'm actually interested to just hear from our people in the audience on is, I feel like at this point in the Dynasty point scoring season, because they're RB1, we're pretty much like at RB2, I think, in points per game for Mixon. Is that correct? That we're looking at probably fair value is a first for these guys. It's probably what you honestly have to pay, and it's probably what's fair to pay if you have a liquid playoff first. You own your own first, and you're pretty much looking at winning the championship, just want to secure that hammer. It's probably actually the right process because scared money doesn't make money, is to pay that first and get it if you can't get it with a different way. But it's just something that's so hard to pay. Like for that reason, actually, like I have Saquon, who I'm willing to pay that for, CMC, who I think we should be willing to pay that for, although like could be wrong. Brooke and Cook in a different tier than Henry and Mixon, because I'm not so sure that those two guys are. I don't have that like they're worth a first, plain and simple. But I do think everyone else in this tier, assuming CMC ever plays again, is worth a first.
Who do you value highest in the tier, Justin?
I probably value Cook highest. I could see valuing Saquon higher. If I'm a team that's competing, I probably will have Saquon higher in my personal rankings because I mean, your process should always slightly be like, if they're in the same tier, if I'm not getting like a pick to go between the two, I probably want the guy who fits my team build a little bit better, right? And honestly, if you're not competing, RBs don't in general fit a team build. If Saquon is my RB1 and I don't have a great RB2, I probably wouldn't go from Saquon to James Cook. But if Saquon is my RB1 and let's say I had something in the neighborhood of Josh Jacobs as my RB2 or Brian Robinson as my RB2, somebody else who I feel like is going to give me RB2 production pretty consistently, then I think I'd take James Cook. But those two are the top of the tier without a doubt for me. And it's kind of just 50-50. If you gave me a third, I would go between the two. David, who's your guy here in the tier that's your number one besides whoever you can get cheapest?
Can that be my answer? No, it actually isn't in this tier. I think, look, you do have to answer competing or not competing first because we've got Brooks and Cook in there. If I'm not competing, I'll still take it could be a boat box of Jonathan Brooks. We don't know what he could be. He could easily be tier one if he has a strong finish to the season. I don't think Cook has that in him personally. And if I'm not competing, for me, it's really between Saquon and Mixon. I think they're a lot closer than the community has them right now. Mixon even has more points per game. I know you missed a couple of games, so it's a smaller sample size, but they're like, 6 months apart in age. So really all I want is the higher producer right there. I think they're about the same producer. I think they have about the same outcome for the rest of the season. I'll take either of them, and I'll happily move around within this tier for probably a third, unless if I'm competing, then obviously Brooks has to be a special consideration, and McCaffrey too with his injury.
Yeah, right now Saquon's RB4 on keep trade cut and Mixon's RB16.
That's crazy to me. That's absolutely crazy to me.
With that evaluation, you might be able to get a first on, take Saquon and get Mixon in a first. I don't know if in reality that's coming true, but take a second for sure. I mean, and you might even get 2 seconds.
I would take a third personally. I don't have this opportunity anywhere, so no one can take advantage of this advice for me. I don't see that big of a difference between them. I just don't. I mean, the market says maybe I should hold out for more, but why are they that far apart? Can anyone tell me?
Saquon's got a big popular name, I guess. And
yeah, I mean, from a contract standpoint, there's not that big of a difference. Mixon got extended upon going there. I think they're both guaranteed for like 2-ish years. Yeah. And at their age, you can't count on them for more than that, even if they had a longer contract. They're 5 months apart in age, I believe, something like that. There's not really a huge reason why there should be any difference. And in fact, you could argue Mixon might be in a better offense for the running back because he doesn't have the QB stealing 3 touchdowns.
Yeah.
Like we just saw from Hurts. Also, there's wide receiver issues, which means more dump offs, more attempt to establish the run. Like,
especially now.
Yeah, I think that just further elaborates the point that James Cook should be the top of the tier.
Maybe. I mean, I do think that, so his points per game, James Cook's like right there with Jonathan Taylor. And I mean, I think it's just the fact that we've seen more from Jonathan Taylor. Like I said, we've seen the RB1 finish, but yeah, I don't really view James Cook and Jonathan Taylor that much different. I'm just thinking back on like, maybe I'd have them in the same tier if we were to split it up. But yeah, Jonathan Brooks, he's also very interesting, which Christian McCaffrey, we didn't really touch on him, but on the Pat McAfee show today, Adam Schefter said that after the bye week, which is this next coming week for the 49ers, that they are hopeful that he's gonna be able to play. So no more 49ers without Chris McCaffrey potentially.
That would be something.
Yeah, and the last thing I want to say here is I do personally have James Cook in the same tier as at least Jonathan Taylor. Kind of reevaluated my process. I don't think I can put him in the exact same tier as Achane, Walker, and Williams.
Right.
Which then can I really put him in the same tier as Jonathan Taylor? But I do think he's almost like potentially in a tier slightly above some of these guys. Somewhere a tweener between tier 2 and tier 3 doesn't kind of fit. 25 having his first RB like one, no doubt about it, season so far because he's getting the touchdown role in the offense. Like he's getting goal line work. They're not just taking him out for Latavius Murray or whoever. He's shown he can get in. He has a nose for the end zone. I do think that personally, and I'm curious about everyone in the comments below. I know some of our regular subscribers are kind of Cook stands, so I'm curious what everyone in the comments has to say about that. Anything else to say in this tier, guys? Otherwise, I'm going to ask David, will you define tier 4 for us moving along?
Sure. Yeah, this one's a bit of a hodgepodge, which is kind of normal as we get to this point in tiers. We've got some older guys with some back end RB1 production. One of the older guys I kind of think belongs in tier 3. He's got RB1 upside. We got a couple of young-ish guys that we count on and love to plug in as RB2, or, you know, if you can flex them, that's great. Definitely an interesting tier here, and I expect they will all be moving in different directions within the next year. But JP, you want to go ahead and read them for us?
Yeah, we got Alvin Kamara here, Isaiah Pacheco, Josh Jacobs, Brian Robinson, and David Montgomery. And Isaiah Pacheco is probably the guy that I might value the highest here. I mean, I could see Alvin Kamara with you on a contender for sure. I think it's pretty close. But Pacheco, I just want to remind everybody just like what he was doing week 1 and 2 is pretty impressive. I mean, has the 5th highest snap share between those first 2 weeks. It's only for 2 weeks compared to everybody else, but on Sleeper, he's showing he has the 5th highest snap share. So he was the clear cut RB1. He was averaging 3.5 catches per game in those 2 games. And he had the goal line role for, you know, maybe it's not a great offense anymore, but it's a pretty good offense still. So I think that he's got to be the guy that I think has the best chance to jump into that tier 3 without a doubt.
For Pacheco, I do also feel like there's a little bit of that Kyron Williams symptom, right? You know, not a 5th round draft pick, 7th round draft pick, right?
Yeah.
It's always on the back of everyone's mind every time I draft or trade for him or I'm trying to trade him away. I'm thinking, like, are the Chiefs going to draft a running back next year to replace Pacheco because they're not that heavily invested in him? Also, because when he gets injured, the offense obviously drops off quite a bit, right? They haven't been the same team without him. They're still winning every game, of course, because they're the Chiefs, but you can tell it's a different team. So like I think there's a little concern there. I actually am a little curious on everyone's opinion on Montgomery in this tier. I was a little surprised to see him at RB13. RB14 is Brian Robinson. RB15 is Pacheco in keep trade cut. So I'm curious on those two guys because Robinson's a little bit younger, has some, you know, I'd say has some job security there. Eckler probably. I'd be surprised if he's still doing much even as the season goes down, let alone next year, you know, just with how old he is, that he wouldn't kind of fade down the stretch, although he has been looking okay. And then Montgomery has a 2 more year extension that he just signed. So I think he's pretty much like 3 years kind of locked up there of doing what he's doing in that amazing Lions offense. So I think those are my 2 guys I'm highest on. David, tell us somebody else that you're higher on than the guys we are, just to show how how literally unable to get on the same page we are as a podcast.
Yeah, I'll get to him in just a second. I do just want to touch on Brian Robinson first because I think he's the other player that stands out to me in this tier. He's 25 still. He before this week where Cook had a blow up week and Robinson had kind of a down week. He and Cook were within like half a point PPR for each other. And we just talked about James Cook as a tier 2 player. They're the same age. I know we can't ignore a blow up week from James Cook. I'm not trying to do that. But I'm just saying I think Brian Robinson definitely has a chance to ascend in tiers here. Player I really want to talk about and get some discussion going on though is Alvin Kamara. He, Mixon, Henry, and Saquon are the top 4 scorers in PPR scoring right now. I know Kamara is 4th, but it's barely 4th. He's 29. Henry's older than him. He is older than obviously Mixon and Saquon. I'm not trying to say I should rank him higher than them. I just don't see much of a reason why we wouldn't put him in the same tier as those guys. He's got the extension. That team's got no money to do anything about changing his role. I think we get at least another season or 2 of dump off city to Kamara.
A good bit of it is inflated to those first 2 weeks when the Saints just were absolutely killing everybody. I just don't think that he looks as good as those guys like Saquon, Derrick Henry. That's what it really is for me, is he just doesn't seem like the same as his prime. And those guys kind of seem like they're still pretty close to at least the way they're playing. They seem like they're still in their primes.
Personally, I agree with you, David. Like I said, I have Henry and Mixon a little bit lower than like the James Cook and whether or not I should Barkley. And for me, with Barkley, it's just the market value, right? And then so I actually have Mixon, Henry, Kamara, Jacobs, and B-Rob all in the same tier. Like, I think you have a very good point. And the fact of the matter is, any of those 3 guys you mentioned are a high ankle sprain potentially, or a, you know, any injury worse than that away from bottoming out in value. If they do that 3-4 weeks from now, have a high ankle sprain where they're not going to be healthy for the fantasy playoffs, like those 3 guys have almost no value at that point, right? They're expiring assets, right? So that's just what can they do for you this year? And JP, do you not think Alvin Kamara is going to be a top 6 RB the rest of the season?
I think he could be for sure, but I'm not super confident just because, like I said, outside the first 2 weeks, it's been solid, but it's not like exactly what we were hoping for after seeing those first 2 weeks, which I think these guys have kind of been a little bit more impressive. But I mean, PPR, he just really racks up the receptions. It's very, very close for me. Not saying that it's not, but I just have him a little bit lower. I mean, with the market as well.
All right, so JP, just to challenge you a little bit there, you have Joe Mixon. So you're going to turn down an offer of Alvin Kamara and a third for Joe Mixon?
I would, yeah, I would turn it down.
What about 2/3?
No, I would need a second.
Okay, so difference is a second right there. All right, moving on to one other question just within this tier. Are we taking, assuming we're competing, are we taking a third to move within any of these players? Like if I offered you a third for any of the players we have in this row here, are you taking that between these guys, JP?
I think in certain situations I would. Just I think with Pacheco and Brian Robinson being younger, that I could see a scenario where I might pivot off if I'm rebuilding, or I guess it'd probably be better to say if I'm contending, right? Just keep it flat. Kamara would be the one because he's really the only one that you think is in that range for a top 5-6 running back. Maybe Pacheco can get there, but definitely not sold on that. So yeah, I probably would move these guys for a third to Kamara. He kind of is in a weird spot for me.
He's definitely in a weird spot. Just real quick to tie up that loose end, Fantasy Pros hasn't input all of week 8 data, so this is a little choppy. Weeks 3 to 7, if you ignore Mixon and JT, who only played in 2 of those 5 weeks, Kamara is RB 14, but that does ignore his 18.2 point performance this week. So still looking at probably back end RB 1. Maybe mid RB1 in that stretch. It definitely impacts things to take away his 40-point game, but I don't know that I would tier down to these other players for just a third. I think, assuming I'm competing, I would need to look at Pacheco's injury if he's coming back soon. It sounds like probably. I just don't know exactly when. He'd be the one I'd be most interested in doing that for. Maybe Brian Robinson, but I think I'd just keep the upside of Kamara. The other 4 players, though, I'd move around for a third between them, I think. Except maybe Jacobs, but I'm not as high on him as we are.
I mean, Jacobs, is he not in scoring RB? I think it was in points, total points, he was up there, but I guess in points per game at 14.7. Yeah, he's definitely, he's down there a bit. So is Brian Robinson. I do think if I'm competing, it's tough to tear down off of Kamara for these guys because the difference is there, but I think I would probably do it for the third just because I hate being so old at RB. This might be a point where I need to improve my process over the next couple of years and be more okay with just being okay with being old at RB and figuring it out later, but I just love getting younger.
I know what you mean. I've kind of shifted my mindset a good bit. I mean, we were like debating about Saquon and the top 4 running backs this year in points per game. They're all 27 through 30 years old. So I think when you see that these guys are really, really good, I mean, even like a guy like Aaron Jones, we've known he's been really, really good. And it's like, oh, well, he's old now, but they still stay good for, I feel like longer than we kind of expect when they are near that elite, type of running back.
And last, just because we did promise to do this for the viewers right before we move on, price point on this tier, I think we're probably looking at a minimum of a second and a third. Are either of you guys willing to pay 2 seconds for guys in this tier?
If they were mid to late seconds, I could see it for any of them, but I don't think I'd pay an early second plus for, well, maybe Pacheco, maybe Robinson. But I would need one of those younger guys that I had some future confidence in.
Say Pacheco and Kamara.
If I'm competing, Kamara has to be in the conversation too. Sorry.
Yeah, Brian Robinson, he's got 9 catches on the year. And I think with Jaden Daniels scrambling, I just think that really lowers his consistency.
Wanted to get that price point in there. I think the price point is probably somewhere between a second and a third and 2 seconds, just depending on where those picks are. Do you guys kind of agree with just sliding scale depending on where those picks are, number of starters, etc.?
Yeah, I think that's a fair range.
All right. And moving on to tier 5. JP, give us a quick definition of this murkier tier we are entering. Actually, there's some exciting stuff in there too.
Yeah, a little bit. And this is really just a bunch of RB2s. They kind of range in age a little bit, but they're all worth around a second round pick in value is what I would say. And who do we have here, Justin?
All right. So the names we have in this tier: Aaron Jones, Najee Harris, J.K. Dobbins, Travis Etienne, Bucky Irving, DeAndre Swift, Tony Pollard, and James Conner. There is one name I think doesn't belong in this tier, or at least if he's in this tier, we should also have his counterpart in there, and that is Travis Etienne. I want to talk a little bit about him because I personally have, and so does Keep Trade Cut, Tank Bigsby ranked above him. Defend yourself, guys, and not having Tank in this tier, having ETN in a tier different than Tank?
Yeah, I mean, I'd have to check my rankings, but I think I had them both in tier 6 or both. I don't know. We did our tiers in kind of a funny way. I was looking over them. I think Justin had a little bigger tiers than I did. I guess the bull case is that we've seen longer periods of high-end production from ETN. I don't really like either of these. I don't want to be a part of this backfield right now. The offense is very inconsistent. Their usage is inconsistent. ETN's hurt, but when he comes back, what's it going to be? You know, Tank Bigsby was one of the worst running backs last year, efficiency-wise, that we've seen in a long time. I know he's shown more than that this year, but it's half a season. I would take just about anything to move between the two, so I guess they should be in the same tier probably, but we're at this point of running backs where there's not a ton of value outside of what are you doing for me right now. So I don't know. I guess I'm talking myself into preferring Tank because he's producing more this week than Travis.
For me, I guess it would be the fact that ETN, I mean, I don't know how much this matters anymore, but he's first round pick and he's athletic and has a pass catching skill set. And this whole year before he got hurt, he was easily out snapping Tank Bigsby, even though Bigsby was more efficient on the ground. Bigsby, the first week ETN was out, he blew up against the Patriots. Like they ran all over them. Last week against the Packers, he had 10 points. So I don't think it's like a surefire thing that he's like an absolute stud when ETN's out, and I don't think it's a surefire thing that he's taken over as well. I kind of think that ETN's still the leader, but yeah, I mean, I don't think their value is much different. It's just that I think the market and I think people are willing to buy back into ETN if they just see a little bit, just because of the first round pick. And he was RB3 last year. I mean, it's not points per game, but he finished as RB3 in total points last year.
Also wanted to talk about DeAndre Swift. Have a question in the show sheet. Don't know who asked this, but it's a good question. Should DeAndre Swift be in tier 4? He's young, had a few good weeks in a row, but he's bounced around in 3 teams.
And look, I'm the one who put the question in there, so I'll start talking about him, I guess. I was very disappointed with how the season started because I have him in a couple places, but he is 3 weeks of 20 points, and then last week he was 18. So 4 weeks in a row over 18 points in PPR scoring, 3 of those in the 20s. That offense is growing in general, so I do think that trend will continue. I don't think it's just something weird that's happened in the season. I think we see that whole offense improving. I'm not sure that he's going to be, you know, a back-end RB1 or mid RB1 like these numbers suggest, but I definitely think there's a real chance. I think he's the one that stands out to me as he doesn't belong in this tier personally.
It is really tough with these dynasty running back rankings because it's like, how reactionary should we be? It's just the fact that I just don't believe in him from a full season standpoint. I mean, the Lions didn't really believe in him. The Eagles were happy to let him go as well. And last year, weeks 2 through 7, he was RB5, and then he kind of just lost his job. So, I mean, that is, I guess, in the range of outcomes. Roschon Johnson's looked good. And I will say Swift this last week, he just had one long run that really bailed him out. He had not a single catch. The goal line work was going to Roschon Johnson and a backup center.
I was going to point out the backup center fumble. Like, that's the amount of faith that they have in Swift, and I guess to some extent Johnson, right? Is that they're giving the ball to a backup center. Like, at this point, like in this whole tier, I mean, we just care about what you can do for us this year, sure, but like if they're giving the backup center the ball at the goal line, I don't think they have much faith in this RV room long term. They want a solution outside of it, I think.
Yeah, and it is really tough because it's like, well, maybe we should raise him up based on what he's doing, but I just don't fully believe in it. Like I said, if he didn't have that long, I think it was like a 50-yard touchdown run, he would have had a dud of a week, which, I mean, he's got that in his bag, but yeah, I just don't trust it completely, and that's why I have him here. Do you have him in tier 4, David, after this conversation?
I do have him in tier 4. I think I had him in tier 4 before.
Gotcha.
Look, I mean, it's what are you doing for me right now? He's scoring a bunch of points, and like I said, that offense is getting better, so I expect it to continue to get better. It is funny that they handed it off to a center. Don't get me wrong, but like a little nod to Refrigerator Perry. Teams get creative. It doesn't mean that like the Lions against the Cowboys were doing all kinds of crazy shit. It doesn't mean that they don't trust their playmakers.
Get my team's name out of your mouth.
They're playing with their food up there in Detroit.
They really were, man. It was hilarious. Like,
putting you to the test a little bit here, David, because we said we're probably willing to pay 2 seconds for at least a couple of those players, potentially all of them, depending if they're late. So are you willing to take DeAndre Swift? So you're taking DeAndre Swift in a playoff second for Kamara?
yeah, I would.
For Pacheco? For any of those guys? So you're taking that?
Yeah,
DeAndre,
give me a second on top. I would take that over Swift in the second over any other in that tier.
DeAndre Swift in a third over anyone in that tier?
That's probably where I would definitely prefer Kamara, probably Robinson, and probably Pacheco, but I might do it for Montgomery and Jacobs. Yeah.
So I think it's maybe maybe like almost like a tweener because like you're willing to go for the third between a lot of players in there, but not.
Well, I mean, our personal tiers are different than our consensus tiers, right? So I have Kamara up in tier 3.
That's fair. How dare you be different than us? And last point we want to nail down on this is just in general, we're competing, we have it to spend, we're paying a playoff second for anyone in this tier, I assume.
I think so. Maybe not ETN just because of the stink on him, but I think I'd have to still. Yeah, just the upside.
I might. I don't know. That's tough. JP, playoff second, pretty much yes, give or take. Maybe ETN.
Connor is the one I don't think quite belongs, but otherwise, yeah.
You wouldn't play a playoff second for Connor if you're competing?
No, I mean, he hasn't really been that good, really. He's been just okay. Like start a bull, but not really excited to start him.
He has more points than per game than in this tier. Najee Harris, at least. Travis Etienne for sure. More points per game than Brian Robinson Jr. in a tier above him.
I mean, those guys are all younger, and James Conner's RB22, so he's just a back in RB2. Am I paying a second for that? I'd rather just look elsewhere for sure. But everybody else here probably would. It's just the swing on ETN. I know he's kind of a weird case right now.
And then on that price point, everyone outside of Connor, I guess for JP, are you willing to pay a random? Could go either way still at this point second?
If I was desperate, but a late second I would. Mid second, like I said, just desperation.
And David, same questions on those two ranges of seconds for you.
I think I would pay a mid for most of them if I'm competing and, had an injury or some other reason where I feel like I need this, but my team is complete otherwise. I think I'd pay a mid second for all of them. Yeah. I wouldn't do it. I would do it reluctantly. I'd look for other options first, but
I feel like I'm in the same type of boat there. Connor is harder to pay the mid second. I agree with JP, but if I had shopped everywhere else and I couldn't do anything else, I would definitely consider it. All right. So moving on to our last and final tier, we're looking at a bunch of guys with some combination of job security that probably is also kind of worth in the range of that second, but we have a lot more upside and youth, I feel like, personally, in this tier here.
Tank Bigsby, Trey Benson, Jordan Mason, Chase Brown, Ramondre Stevenson, and Rashad White. My apologies on messing up the graphic. Bucky Irving's face should be in tier 5 where we talked about him, but not here in tier 6 where, other than that, though, I think, Justin, you kind of hit the nail on the head there. It's not much production we can trust in for any period of time, but some serious upside here, some guys that we like. Let's start it kind of open-ended there. Who's your favorite guy here if you were doing like a startup and you were going to take a running back? This was the board.
I would go with the upside of Trey Benson still, just because he's still kind of a mystery box. I mean, we like his prospect profile still, and we didn't expect him to produce early. It is disappointing because he's not producing like at all. We would have hoped to see at least something, maybe some flashes. But still, with the draft capital that he did get and the athleticism he possesses, I would take him first out of the guys in this tier.
Yeah, no, it really does depend. If we're looking at this tier of players, I assume we're looking at kind of the 9 to 11 round range is usually where you'll see players like this far down the RB doldrums going. I think it just depends on my build, right? If I'm in like a productive struggle type of build where I'm like, I do like in a productive struggle to kind of just take upside swings on running backs, like I probably would be looking at a Tank Bigsby, a Chase Brown type of guy, a guy that I think has the potential to be like a RB2-ish. I'm interested in Ramondre Stevenson if I feel like I can be competitive. I'm interested in Rashad White potentially at this sort of a price point too. Like probably the way I would go is I would go Tank Bigsby if I'm productive struggle, or Trey Benson.
Okay.
I'd flip a coin. I'd try to trade down and then get the other guy if I could. If I had to make a pick, I think I'd probably I'd put Tank Bigsby ahead of Benson, just because assuming I was doing a startup that was playing like the rest of the season in theory, right? Like I think he'll give me more the rest of the season, and I'm interested in that. If I'm trying to compete, I think I probably prefer Ramondre in this package, just because I think he's going to PPR his way quite a bit. I think Drake May has showed he's kind of going to make Ramondre and Henry relevant by using them a little bit as a security blanket and opening up the running lanes for Ramondre. So I think it's Ramondre if I'm competing, Tank if I'm not, probably.
I mean, we've seen Tank be good, at least for the case for him over Trey Benson. I just think with Trey Benson, if he ends the season hot, he might be worth something close to a first round pick, and he might be the only guy in this tier I see that for. I mean, Tank might be able to get there if he really does take over, because he has been pretty good. But I got to ask, how do you guys feel about Jordan Mason right now? If CMC is back next week and moving forward, is he just a luxury handcuff? Is he playable at all if you're in a pinch, David?
It's a big gamble. If you have CMC, he's probably the most attractive player in this tier for you. If not, you're kind of betting like, hey, we're not doctors. I know there's some that play this game, don't get me wrong, but most of us aren't doctors. doctors. It doesn't sound great for CMC. It sounds like there's definitely a chance he comes back and takes his role back and is, the RB1 from whenever he comes back to when he leaves. There's a chance that he comes back and re-injures himself or tears an Achilles and he's done for his career. At that point, Mason probably moves up a tier or two. It's a big time gamble. Don't get me wrong. He's probably the person I would take last in a startup of this group unless I had CMC. The upside is definitely there for him, obviously, because we have seen it in that offense.
All right, so if you're rebuilding, you're probably willing to hold on to a Tank Bigsby, a Trey Benson, unless you get a overwhelming offer, right? But you're ecstatic to move off of Ramondre, Rashad White. We'd probably say even Chase Brown, Jordan Mason, guys we could definitely move off of if we're rebuilding. So what is the kind of the low end price point you're willing to take on those guys if you're in a rebuild?
Man, I don't think I could take a third. I'd rather hold at that price, but maybe a 2-3 swap might be the lowest.
Yeah, I mean, I think the only way I'd consider a third is if I'm in a battle for lowest points with someone and I need to shed points. At this point in the season, hopefully you've done that. But, Chase Brown wasn't scoring a ton of points in the beginning of the year, so maybe you've got him sitting there. Kind of the same thing with Mondre and Rashad White. They had a little bit of a dip in production. So, yeah, if I need to shed some points, I'd feel dirty doing it, but I would think about a mid to early third. I think it would probably take more like 2/3 or a 2-3 swap, though.
Yeah, I'm with Jordan Mason. You could probably just sit back on that and just hope for.
Sure. You roll the dice there. Absolutely.
Hopefully, if you're in a rebuild, you already sold Mason. All right. And moving on from this tier six, we're going to just do a couple honorable mentions, guys that were not on our tier chart here. Starting with JP, who's a guy that you want to shout out? Maybe someone who had a good game tonight.
Tyrone Tracy, he's the first guy I want to talk about here. And maybe he even belongs in tier 6 because when he filled in for Devin Singletary when he got injured in week 5, he had 129 rush yards and 7.2 yards per carry. He looked great. I think I saw a stat that it said that he was the only running back with over 100 yards this season that didn't lose a yard on a carry. It was something along the lines of that was very impressive for a guy who was a former wide receiver. And speaking of him being a former wide receiver, in week 6, he had led the Giants in receiving yards. He had 6 catches for 57 yards. Actually, he tied for the lead with Darius Slayton there. But he's been very impressive. And Singletary, he came back in week 7. Tracy outsnapped him. It's like, okay, well, maybe they're just working Devin Singletary back in. Well, the game just finished up here as we're recording in week 8, and Tyrone Tracy outtouched Devin Singletary 20 carries to 2. I mean, Tracy had 145 yards, and he had a touchdown, 3 targets. So before this game, maybe we had him here, but after this game, do you guys think he belongs in tier 6?
Probably, at least, yeah. I think seeing that kind of usage, I expected him to lead the backfield, but 20 to 2 that's pretty big there.
I agree as well, unless it comes out that Singletary is actually injured, which I don't think he is. I think he's got a clean bill of health, isn't on the injury report. So unless we hear in the next 48 hours there was something, yeah, I think there's just been a change. So I think I agree.
Yeah, probably got to put him up near Bucky Irving if this is the way the usage is going to go.
Yeah, I might need to see another week before making that change, but honestly, maybe you can just be aggressive and value him pretty similar to Bucky if you can buy him before it really skyrockets. But after today's performance, it might be tough.
Agree. And David, who is your guy that you want to shout out here from lower?
Yeah, I don't at all value him over Tracy. I think Tracy's probably the nail on the head there for value. But as far as just giving a shout out, I think it's probably the cheapest production you could buy right now if you're competing. Alexander Madison is the guy in Las Vegas. It's a bad offense, don't get me wrong, but he's getting about 20 opportunities a game, which is great volume. He's scoring, mid-teens roughly is probably what you can expect, I think, rest of season for him. And we don't even have him in our top 6 tiers. It's probably not rude to offer a third for him, even if I don't know that gets it done. But I think that's a starting point.
I have him auto accept third in one league where I'm trying to I'd be ecstatic to get a third for him if I'm not competing.
And if you are competing and you can get that production for a third, you should be ecstatic as well. So that's just who I wanted to give a quick shout out to. I don't think he's a massive game changer for anybody, but if you need a guy to fill in for an injury or something, you got some nasty bye weeks coming around the corner and some big matchups, go get a cheap Alexander Madison. And Justin, you want to go ahead and give us your guy?
Yeah, my guy is Javonte Williams. He's only averaging 11 points per game, which is pretty nondescript in PPR. Very replaceable, very replacement level guy. But he has been the guy so far in Denver. I would say that we expected that role to yield more points. Of course, we're still seeing some Jaleel McLaughlin mixed in. We're seeing Estime occasionally now that he's been back getting some carries. We've seen other guys getting carries, Beatty for a second there, etc. He's still getting a lot of work. He had one real boom game on Thursday Night Football against the Saints. Outside of that, hasn't been doing all that much. For me, it's just, I think the offense is trending in the right direction. He's a guy that if he has another down week, but the offense is still trending in the right direction, just seems things didn't go his way. Bo Nick Vulture's a touchdown, whatever happens. I'm looking to make some offers of, seeing if I can offer a third and a fourth for him, something like that. He's a guy I'm very interested in adding as a bye week filler with, I think, upside. I do still think that this offense is trending in the right direction. It's a rookie quarterback. They're getting more creative, more confident, more comfortable opening up the offense. And I think that should help Javonte down the stretch, assuming that he retains the job. So no way I'm offering a second for this guy, but third plus. I think that's a good upside swing. I'm very happy to try to make.
I think I have all three of these guys on one team. I'd have to double check, but
That does seem like a David running back room. All right. Well, thank you for joining us for this long episode of the Dino Construction Podcast. We hope you found this as helpful for you as it was for us. Please remember to like and subscribe wherever you view. And from all of us here at the Dino Construction Podcast, until next time.